Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into something that'll probably make you question everything you think you know about wealth, power, and what actually makes people happy. We're talking about royals, kings, queens, emperors who had dreams so vivid about living as ordinary people that they woke up desperately wanting to throw away their crowns and live in poverty. I mean, imagine having literally everything money can buy, and then your subconscious shows you a completely different life, and you wake up thinking, yeah, I'll take the mud hut and the turnip soup, thanks. So before you settle in for the night, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these bizarre historical dream journeys we take together. And I'm always curious, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. It's fascinating how these strange stories connect people across continents and time zones. Now get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe grab your coziest blanket, and prepare to enter the world of royal dreams that turned everything upside down. And hey, if you drift off somewhere in the middle of this, that's exactly what we're going for here. Though honestly, some of these stories are so bizarre you might find yourself staying awake longer than planned. Dreams don't just happen to you, they happen through you. And sometimes they completely flip your understanding of what you thought you wanted in life. So picture this, it's 1788, just 1 year before the French Revolution would literally lose him his head. And King Louis XVI, the guy with more wealth than most countries has the most life-changing dream of his entire existence. In his dream, Louis wasn't the king of France, he wasn't even nobility. He was Pierre, a simple baker in a small village outside Paris, and he was happy. Like genuinely, deeply happy in a way he'd never experienced in his waking life as the most powerful man in Europe. Now, I want you to really picture what this meant for Louis. This is a guy who had been king since he was 19 years old, who had never in his entire life experienced what it was like to work with his hands, to create something that people actually needed to feel genuinely useful in the world. His entire existence was ceremonial signing documents that other people wrote, attending meetings where other people made the real decisions, being constantly told he was important while secretly suspecting he was basically a very expensive decoration. But Dream Pierre had purpose. Real, tangible, life-sustaining purpose. The dream always started the same way. Pierre would wake up in a small cottage, and when I say small, we're talking maybe 2 rooms total, with rough wooden floors and simple furniture that he had built himself. The cottage sat above a village bakery, and Pierre could smell the residual warmth from yesterday's ovens drifting up through the floorboards. Not the artificial perfumes and elaborate scents that filled Versailles, but the honest, earthy smell of bread and wood smoke and morning air. Louis described the sensory details of this dream with an intensity that almost sounds like religious revelation. Dream Pierre's hands were rough from years of kneading dough. His arms were strong from lifting bags of flour. His back ached in the satisfying way that comes from meaningful physical work. This was completely foreign to Louis, whose hands had never touched anything rougher than silk, whose physical discomfort usually came from standing through elaborate court ceremonies rather than from productive labor. In the dream, Pierre would dress in simple clothes, a rough linen shirt, wool trousers, leather apron, and walk downstairs to begin his day's work. But here's what made this dream so psychologically powerful for Louis. Pierre looked forward to his work. He woke up eager to begin baking, excited about the bread he would create, genuinely pleased at the prospect of serving his community. Can you imagine what this felt like for a king who dreaded most of his daily obligations? Louis spent his waking hours being dragged from one tedious ceremony to another, surrounded by people who smiled at him while planning to use him for their own political purposes. But Dream Pierre lived in a world where work was satisfying, where relationships were genuine, where his efforts produced immediate, tangible benefits for people he cared about. The baking process in the dream was described by Louis with almost mystical reverence. Dream Pierre would begin by checking his sourdough starter, a living culture that had been passed down through generations of bakers in his family. Louis had never experienced anything being passed down through genuine tradition rather than royal inheritance. The sourdough represented continuity based on skill and care rather than political power. Pierre would mix flour, water, salt, and starter with his bare hands, feeling the texture change as the ingredients combined into dough. Louis wrote that he could remember the exact sensation of the dough becoming elastic under his fingers, the way it would stick to his hands at first and then gradually develop the smooth, slightly tacky texture that meant it was ready for kneading. The kneading process was where Dream Pierre found meditation and peace. For 20 minutes or more, he would work the dough with steady, rhythmic motions, pushing it away with the heel of his hand, folding it back, turning it a quarter turn, and repeating. Louis described this as the most relaxing activity he had ever experienced, even though it only existed in his dream. Think about what this meant psychologically. Louis spent his waking hours in a world where every gesture was scrutinized. Every word was analyzed for political implications. Every moment was performed for an audience that was constantly judging his royal worthiness. But Dream Pierre's kneading was private, purposeful, meditative. No one was watching, no one was evaluating his technique, no one cared whether his movements were appropriately regal. After kneading, Dream Pierre would shape the dough into loaves and set them to rise in a warm corner of the bakery. This waiting period, which could last several hours, was another aspect of the dream that Louis found profoundly appealing. Pierre would use this time to clean his workspace, repair equipment, chat with early customers who stopped by to reserve their daily bread. But here's what made these customer interactions so meaningful for Louis. People came to see Pierre because they needed what he provided, not because protocol required them to appear at court. When Madame d'Abois stopped by to order extra loaves for her daughter's wedding, or when young Jacques came to buy sweet rolls for his grandmother's birthday, they were engaging with Pierre as equals who valued his skill and service. Louis had never experienced being valued for his actual capabilities rather than his inherited position. Every conversation he had as king was filtered through layers of artificial deference, political calculation, and ceremonial requirements. But Dream Pierre's customers talked to him like a normal person whose work they appreciated and whose company they enjoyed. The baking process itself was where Dream Pierre found his greatest satisfaction. As the loaves rose, Pierre would prepare his ovens, building fires with seasoned wood and monitoring the temperature by watching how quickly flour would brown when thrown onto the oven floor. This was practical skill that Louis found fascinating, the ability to control and direct natural processes through knowledge, experience, and careful attention. When the ovens reached the perfect temperature, Pierre would slide his loaves onto the hot stones using long wooden paddles. Louis described the sound of the crust beginning to form, the way steam would escape from scoring marks on top of the loaves, the gradually darkening color that indicated proper baking. He could smell the developing crust, hear the subtle crackling sounds that meant the bread was baking correctly. But the moment that Louis found most emotionally powerful was when Pierre would remove finished loaves from the oven. The bread would be golden brown, with a crispy crust that would make soft popping sounds as it cooled. Pierre would tap the bottom of each loaf to check for the hollow sound that indicated perfect baking. And then he would have created something. Not something decorative, not something symbolic, not something designed to impress people with royal magnificence. Pierre had created food, actual nourishment that would sustain families. That would become part of children's lunches and family dinners and workers' midday meals. His work would literally become part of other people's bodies, giving them energy to live their lives. Louis wrote that this feeling of genuine usefulness was so overwhelming in the dream that he would sometimes wake up crying. He had never in his real life created anything that directly improved anyone's day-to-day existence. His royal decisions affected millions of people theoretically, but abstractly, through layers of bureaucracy and implementation that removed him from any direct connection to their actual lives. The customer interactions throughout Pierre's day provided Louis with a vision of authentic human relationships that he had never experienced as king. When customers came to buy bread, they would chat about their families, their work, their concerns and joys. Pierre knew that Monsieur Rousseau's arthritis was worse in damp weather, that the widow Moreau was struggling to feed her children on her small income, that the young couple who had just moved to the village was expecting their first child. These weren't political intelligence or strategic information. They were the normal human connections that develop when people interact regularly as equals. Pierre was part of his community in ways that King Louis, despite ruling over millions of French citizens, had never been part of any community. Louis also wrote about how Dream Pierre handled money. When customers paid for their bread, the transaction was straightforward and honest. Pierre set fair prices based on the cost of ingredients and the value of his work. Customers paid what they owed, and both parties felt good about the exchange. There was no taxation, no complex financial systems, no political implications, just honest trade between people who respected each other. This was completely different from Louis's experience with royal finances, which were incredibly complex, politically sensitive, and often felt exploitative. Royal wealth came from taxes collected from people who had no choice about paying, and royal spending was constantly criticized as excessive or inappropriate. Louis never felt good about royal financial transactions because they were always tinged with guilt, political pressure, or resentment from his subjects. As the day progressed in Pierre's dream world, the baker would gradually sell most of his bread to regular customers and visitors. But he would always set aside loaves for families he knew were struggling financially, offering them day-old bread at reduced prices or sometimes giving away unsold loaves to children whose parents couldn't afford them. This casual generosity was something that Louis found deeply appealing. Pierre could help people directly, immediately, without bureaucracy or political consideration. If a family needed bread and couldn't afford it, Pierre could simply give it to them. The decision was his to make. The impact was immediate and personal, and the satisfaction was genuine. Louis, by contrast, was surrounded by elaborate court procedures for charitable giving that turned every act of generosity into a political statement. Royal charity was always ceremonial, always public, always designed to enhance the king's reputation rather than simply help people who needed assistance. The end of Pierre's workday was perhaps the most poignant part of the dream for Louis. As evening approached, Pierre would clean his workspace, prepare sourdough starter for the next day's baking, and close the bakery with the satisfaction that comes from completing meaningful work. He had fed his community, earned an honest living, and used his skills to serve a genuine human need. Pierre would then climb the stairs to his simple cottage, where he would prepare a modest dinner using bread he had baked that morning, simple ingredients he could afford on a baker's income, and recipes that had been passed down through his family. The meal would be basic but satisfying, eaten without ceremony or political consideration, in the company of his own thoughts and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. Louis wrote that watching Dream Pierre's simple evening routine was more emotionally moving than any of the elaborate court entertainments that filled his royal evenings. Pierre's contentment was genuine, earned through his own efforts, connected to real accomplishment rather than inherited privilege. When Dream Pierre finally went to bed in his small cottage, he would fall asleep quickly, tired from physical work but satisfied with his day's contribution to his community. His sleep was peaceful, undisturbed by political worries, diplomatic crises, or the constant pressure of royal obligations that kept Louis awake many nights despite his luxurious accommodations. Louis would wake from these dreams feeling more rested and peaceful than he ever felt after nights in his royal bed at Versailles. The dream sleep that Pierre experienced felt more genuine and restorative than the actual sleep that Louis struggled to find amid the stress and artificiality of court life. The psychological impact of these dreams on Louis was profound and lasting. He began to understand that wealth and power, rather than providing satisfaction and security, had actually isolated him from the kinds of experiences that create genuine happiness and meaning. Dream Pierre lived a life of authentic relationships, meaningful work, and direct connection to his community, everything that Louis's royal existence prevented him from experiencing. Louis started making small changes to his daily routine, trying to access some of the satisfaction that Dream Pierre found in his work. He would wake earlier before his official royal schedule began and spend time in the palace gardens with his hands in the soil, tending plants and understanding what it felt like to nurture growing things. He also began visiting the palace kitchens more frequently, asking the bakers to teach him about bread-making techniques. The kitchen staff was initially bewildered by their king's interest in such mundane matters, but Louis persisted, finding genuine joy in learning skills that Pierre had mastered in his dreams. Most significantly, Louis began questioning the entire structure of royal life and whether the elaborate artificial world of Versailles actually served any useful purpose. If Pierre the baker could find such deep satisfaction in his simple life of service, what did that say about the value of royal luxury and ceremonial power? These questions, inspired by his dream of authentic work and genuine community, may have contributed to Louis's downfall. His growing sympathy for common people and his doubts about royal privilege made him more receptive to revolutionary ideas, but less effective at defending the monarchy against political attacks. When the revolution began and Louis faced the guillotine, he wrote in his final letters that he sometimes wondered whether his dreams of being Pierre the baker had been visions of the life he should have chosen rather than nightmares about the life he couldn't have. Sometimes our subconscious shows us truths about happiness that our conscious minds are too trapped by circumstances to pursue. Catherine the Great of Russia, the woman who expanded the Russian Empire, corresponded with Voltaire and basically redefined what it meant to be an enlightened monarch, had a recurring dream that haunted her for months, and eventually led to one of the most bizarre social experiments in royal history. Starting in 1782, Catherine began having the same dream every few weeks. In the dream, she wasn't Catherine II, Empress of all the Russias. She was Katya, a peasant woman living in a small wooden house in a remote Siberian village, married to a blacksmith named Ivan, with 3 children who called her Mama and meant it in the way that only children who completely depend on you can mean it. Now, Catherine was known for her intellect, her political cunning, and her ability to manipulate complex court politics. But Dream Katya lived in a world where problems were immediate and solutions were physical. If the roof leaked, you fixed it with your own hands. If your family was hungry, you grew vegetables, raised chickens, preserved food for winter. If your neighbors needed help, you helped them, not because of political alliances, but because that's what communities did to survive. Let me paint you the picture of what Katya's world looked like, because Catherine described it in her private journals with the kind of detail that suggests these dreams felt more real to her than her actual palace life. The wooden house where Dream Katya lived was small, maybe 3 rooms total, but it was warm and filled with the sounds of family life. Children laughing, her husband humming while he worked on household repairs, the crackling of the fire that provided both heat and light. The house sat in a clearing surrounded by birch and pine forests that stretched to the horizon. Catherine had seen the Russian wilderness during her official tours, but always from the windows of elaborate carriages, surrounded by guards and officials, insulated from any real contact with the natural world. Dream Katya, though, lived inside the wilderness. She knew which mushrooms were safe to eat, which berries ripened when, how to read weather patterns by watching the way birds flew or the way pine needles moved in the wind. But here's what made this dream so psychologically powerful for Catherine: the relationships. As Empress, she was surrounded by people who wanted things from her: political favors, land grants, titles, military positions. Every conversation was calculated, every interaction had ulterior motives. Even her closest advisors were constantly maneuvering for advantage, presenting her with information that was filtered through their own agendas and ambitions. Dream Katya lived in a completely different emotional universe. When her husband even came home exhausted from the blacksmith forge, he would collapse into her arms, not because she was powerful, but because she was his wife and he loved her. The affection was genuine, uncomplicated by any political considerations or social climbing. Ivan didn't need anything from Katya except her presence, her partnership in building their family life together. Catherine wrote extensively about Ivan in her dream journals, and you can feel her longing for this kind of authentic relationship. Ivan was described as a large, gentle man with hands permanently stained by soot from his forge work, who would come home each evening tired but satisfied with his day's labor. He made horseshoes, farm tools, household implements that people in their village actually needed and used. When Ivan and Katya talked in the evenings, they discussed real, immediate things, whether they had enough firewood stored for winter, how their vegetable garden was growing, which of their neighbors needed help with harvest work, what their children had learned or accomplished that day. These weren't abstract political theories or diplomatic strategies. They were conversations about the texture of daily life, about problems that could be solved through work and planning, about relationships with people they knew personally and cared about. The children in Catherine's dream were perhaps the most emotionally complex part of the experience. As Empress, Catherine had given birth to a son who was immediately taken, away to be raised by court officials according to royal protocols. She had minimal contact with him during his childhood, and their relationship was formal, distant, shaped more by political considerations than by natural maternal affection. But Dream Katya's children, 2 daughters and a son, ranging in age from about 5 to 12, were completely integrated into her daily life. They helped with household tasks, played games that Katya remembered from her own childhood, asked questions about everything they observed in their forest environment, and came to her with the kind of immediate emotional needs that children have when they trust their parents completely. Catherine described the physical sensation of Dream Katya's children, climbing onto her lap when they were tired or scared or just wanted affection. She could feel their small bodies relaxing against hers, could smell their hair and skin, could experience the deep mammalian satisfaction that comes from comforting your young. This was completely different from the formal, ceremonial interactions she had with her actual son, which were always mediated by court protocol and political considerations. In the dream, when Katya's children got sick, which happened regularly in a world without modern medicine, she would care for them directly, staying awake all night to monitor fevers, preparing herbal remedies that village women had taught her, holding them when they were in pain or afraid. The responsibility was total, immediate, and deeply personal in ways that Catherine had never experienced as an actual mother. But the children also brought joy that was equally immediate and personal. When Dream Katya's daughter successfully learned to weave a basket or her son caught his first fish, their excitement and pride were shared directly with her without any intermediaries or formal presentations. Catherine wrote that watching dream children's faces light up with accomplishment was more emotionally satisfying than any court ceremony or diplomatic triumph she had experienced as Empress. The daily work of Dream Katya's life was another aspect that Catherine found deeply appealing. As Empress, Catherine's work was entirely abstract, reading reports, making decisions that affected millions of people she would never meet, engaging in diplomatic negotiations where the consequences might not be apparent for months or years. But Katya's work produced immediate, tangible results that directly improved her family's life. When Dream Katya worked in her vegetable garden, she could see plants growing day by day in response to her care. When she preserved vegetables and meat for winter storage, she was creating security that would keep her family fed during months when fresh food wasn't available. When she mended clothes or made new garments, she was directly providing for her family's comfort and protection from harsh Siberian weather. Catherine described the physical satisfaction of this work in detail that suggests she was hungry for genuine accomplishment. Dream Katya's hands were rough and stained from garden work, cooking, cleaning, and crafts. Her back ached from bending over vegetable plots, her arms were strong from carrying water, firewood, and heavy household items. But this physical discomfort felt meaningful, because it was connected to essential tasks that sustained her family's survival and well-being. This was completely different from Catherine's experience as Empress, where physical comfort was maintained by hundreds of servants, and where her personal needs were met through elaborate systems that she never had to think about or understand. Dream Katya's physical work connected her directly to the basic requirements of human survival: food, shelter, warmth, safety. The seasonal rhythms of Dream Katya's life provided another kind of satisfaction that Catherine had never experienced in her actual royal existence. Katya's year was structured around natural cycles: planting in spring, tending crops through summer, harvesting in fall, preparing for and surviving winter. Each season brought specific tasks, challenges, and rewards that connected her family's activities to the larger patterns of the natural world. Catherine wrote about how Dream Katya would know exactly when to plant different vegetables by observing soil temperature, daylight patterns, and the behavior of wild plants. She knew when to harvest by watching for subtle changes in color, texture, and size that indicated peak ripeness. She could predict harsh weather by watching animal behavior and atmospheric changes that city people never learned to notice. This knowledge was practical, reliable, and personally earned through years of careful observation and experience. Catherine, despite her extensive education and intellectual interests, had never developed this kind of intimate understanding of natural processes. Her royal education had focused on languages, history, philosophy, and politics, all important but all abstract compared to the immediate, tactile knowledge that Dream Katya possessed. The community relationships in Dream Katya's village represented another form of authentic connection that Catherine longed for. The village was small enough that Katya knew every family personally, understood their individual circumstances, strengths, and needs. When neighbors helped each other, which happened regularly, it was based on genuine affection and mutual support rather than political calculation or social obligation. Catherine described village gatherings where families would share meals, tell stories, celebrate seasonal festivals, or work together on projects that benefited the entire community. These social interactions were warm, informal, and emotionally nourishing in ways that court entertainments never were. People laughed spontaneously, shared genuine concerns and joys, and related to each other as equals despite differences in age, skill, or personality. The contrast with Catherine's actual social life was stark. Court gatherings were elaborate performances where everyone was constantly aware of hierarchy, political positioning, and the need to impress or influence others. Conversations were strategic, laughter was calculated, and genuine emotion was considered inappropriate or dangerous. Dream Katya also had friendships with other village women that Catherine found particularly appealing. These were relationships based on shared experiences, mutual support, and genuine affection rather than political alliance or social advancement. When Katya's friends visited, they would work together on household tasks while talking about their families, sharing advice about everything from child-rearing to food preservation, and providing emotional support during difficult times. Catherine wrote extensively about the conversations between Dream Katya and her female friends, noting how different they were from the careful, formal exchanges between court ladies at Versailles. Village women could be completely honest about their fears, hopes, frustrations, and joys because they didn't need to worry about political implications or social climbing. Their friendships were built on trust, shared experience, and mutual care rather than strategic networking. The religious and spiritual aspects of Dream Katya's life also provided Catherine with experiences that felt more authentic than the elaborate court ceremonies she participated in as empress. Katya's spirituality was simple, personal, and integrated into daily life. She would pray for her family's health and safety, feel grateful for good harvests and mild weather, and find comfort in the belief that her loved ones were protected by divine care. This private, heartfelt spirituality was completely different from the public political religious observances that Catherine participated in as empress. Court religious ceremonies were elaborate displays designed to demonstrate royal piety and political legitimacy, rather than expressions of genuine faith or spiritual need. Catherine also wrote about how Dream Katya handled difficulties and tragedies in ways that seemed more emotionally healthy than the approaches available to an empress. When problems arose, crop failures, illnesses, accidents, Katya could respond directly and immediately. She could work harder, ask neighbors for help, adapt her family's activities to meet new challenges, and feel that her efforts made a difference in the outcome. As Empress, Catherine's responses to crises were always mediated through layers of bureaucracy and administration. She could issue orders and allocate resources, but she couldn't directly solve problems with her own hands or see immediate results from her efforts. The distance between imperial decisions and their real-world consequences meant that Catherine rarely experienced the satisfaction of personally overcoming difficulties through her own work and determination. The most psychologically complex aspect of Catherine's Dream Katya experiences was how they made her question the value and meaning of imperial power. Dream Katya had no political influence, no ability to affect the lives of strangers, no historical significance beyond her immediate family and village. But her life was filled with authentic relationships, meaningful work, and direct connection to the natural world and human community. Catherine began to wonder whether the elaborate artificial world of imperial court life was actually preventing her from experiencing the kinds of relationships and activities that create genuine happiness and personal satisfaction. Dream Katya was poor in material terms, but rich in exactly the experiences that Catherine found herself hungering for: authentic love, meaningful work, genuine community, direct engagement with the natural world. This psychological conflict led Catherine to make one of the most bizarre decisions in royal history. She decided to try living like Dream Katya while still maintaining her imperial responsibilities. In 1783, she had a small peasant cottage built on the grounds of one of her palaces, complete with a working vegetable garden, chickens, and basic furniture that she made herself with the help of palace carpenters who were sworn to secrecy about their empress's unusual hobby. Several times a week, Catherine would dismiss all her servants, put on simple peasant clothes, and spend hours in this cottage living as close to Dream Katya's life as possible. She would cook simple meals over a wood fire, tend to the garden, repair things that broke, and perform all the daily tasks that Dream Katya did so effortlessly in her Siberian village. The court was absolutely scandalized when rumors of Catherine's peasant cottage began circulating. Imagine the most powerful ruler in Europe, a woman who controlled the largest country in the world, spending her afternoons pretending to be a peasant in a fake cottage, growing vegetables and cooking over open fires like a common villager. Foreign ambassadors didn't know what to make of it. Some thought she was having a mental breakdown. Others suspected it was some elaborate political strategy they couldn't understand. Her own advisors were concerned that news of the Empress's peasant experiments would undermine Russian prestige in European diplomatic circles. But Catherine's journals from this period reveal something remarkable. She wrote that the hours spent as cottage Catherine were the happiest of her reign. She felt what she called the peace of useful simplicity, the satisfaction of work that produced immediate, tangible results, and the absence of the complex political calculations that filled every other moment of her imperial life. Catherine described the sensory pleasures of her cottage experiments in detail that reveals how hungry she was for authentic experiences. She loved the smell of wood smoke, the texture of soil under her fingernails, the taste of vegetables she had grown herself, the satisfying tiredness that came from physical work. These simple sensations felt more real and valuable to her than all the luxury and sophistication of imperial life. The cottage experiments also gave Catherine insights into the daily realities of her subjects' lives that influenced her later policies. After spending time cooking over wood fires, hauling water, and preserving food, she began implementing reforms aimed at improving conditions for actual peasants and village workers. She established schools in rural areas, improved legal protections for agricultural workers, and created programs to provide better medical care in remote villages. Some historians argue that Catherine's dream-inspired cottage experiment made her a more effective ruler because it gave her direct experience with the practical challenges that ordinary Russians faced every day. Her policies became more realistic and helpful because she understood from personal experience what kinds of improvements would actually make a difference in people's daily lives. But other historians point out that Catherine's peasant experience was still fundamentally artificial. She could return to luxury and power whenever she wanted, which real peasants could never do. Her cottage experiments were voluntary adventures rather than genuine hardship, and this limitation meant that her understanding of peasant life remained incomplete despite her sincere efforts. The really poignant aspect of Catherine's story is that she continued having the Dream Katya dreams throughout her life, but they gradually became more bittersweet. As she aged and her imperial responsibilities increased, the cottage experiments became less frequent. She wrote in her later journals that she sometimes felt like she was living the wrong life, that perhaps she would have been happier as an actual peasant woman rather than as an empress who occasionally played at being one. Catherine also struggled with the psychological implications of preferring Dream Katya's relationships over her actual imperial relationships. She began to question whether the elaborate deference and artificial respect that surrounded her as empress was actually preventing her from experiencing genuine human connection. If Dream Katya could have authentic friendships and family relationships, what did that say about the emotional poverty of imperial life? In her final years, Catherine wrote extensively about the tension between power and happiness, noting that increasing her political influence seemed to decrease her personal satisfaction. She had achieved everything that ambitious people dream of: absolute power, historical significance, intellectual recognition, material luxury. But Dream Katya's simple life of family and community had felt more emotionally fulfilling than any of her imperial accomplishments. Catherine died in 1796, still one of the most powerful and successful monarchs in history. But among her personal effects, her servants found dozens of simple, handmade objects, wooden spoons, embroidered cloth, preserved vegetables that she had created during her cottage sessions. It's like she was trying to hold on to pieces of the dream life that had felt more real to her than her actual imperial existence. The tragedy of Catherine's story is that she discovered through her dreams what would have made her genuinely happy, but she was trapped by circumstances and responsibilities that made it impossible to pursue that happiness authentically. Her cottage experiments were attempts to access Dream Katya's satisfaction, but they remained artificial because Catherine could never truly escape her imperial identity. Makes you think about the relationship between power and happiness, doesn't it? Catherine had the ability to reshape entire continents, but she dreamed about growing turnips and mending socks. Sometimes what we think we want and what would actually fulfill us are completely opposite things, and our dreams are the only place where we get to experience the truth about ourselves. Emperor Kangxi of China, we're talking about the guy who ruled for 61 years, expanded the Qing dynasty to its largest size, and was basically the definition of absolute power, had a dream in 1698. That was so psychologically disruptive, it nearly caused him to abdicate the throne and triggered what historians call the greatest succession crisis in Chinese imperial history. Now, to understand why this dream was so significant, you need to know that Kangxi was not just any emperor. He was considered the son of heaven, a divine intermediary between the celestial realm and earthly affairs. In Chinese imperial philosophy, the emperor wasn't just a political leader, he was a cosmic necessity, maintaining the balance between heaven and earth through his divine mandate. But in his dream, Kangxi wasn't divine at all. He was Cheng, a rice farmer in a remote village in Guangdong province, and he was content, not happy in a dramatic, life-changing way, but quietly, deeply content in a manner that he realized he had never experienced during his entire reign as the most powerful person in China. Let me tell you exactly what Dream Chun's world looked like, because Kangxi documented these dreams with the obsessive detail of someone trying to capture an experience that felt more real than his waking life. Chun lived in a small wooden house with paper windows and a tiled roof, surrounded by terraced rice paddies that climbed up the hillsides in perfect geometric patterns that had been maintained for centuries. The house itself was simple but perfectly functional, 3 rooms total, with sleeping mats that could be rolled up during the day, low wooden tables for meals, and walls decorated only with a few family photographs and a small shrine to ancestors. No golden dragons, no precious stones, no elaborate furniture designed to impress visitors with imperial magnificence. Just the basic elements needed for a comfortable family life. But here's what made this dream so psychologically powerful for Kangxi: the relationship between Dream Chun and his rice paddies. As emperor, Kangxi owned all of China. Every mountain, every river, every grain of rice grown in every field belonged to him legally and theoretically. But he had never touched the soil, never planted anything, never watched something grow from a seed he had planted with his own hands. Dream Chun knew every inch of his rice farm with an intimacy that Kangxi described as almost mystical. Chun could walk through his paddies in complete darkness and know exactly where he was by the sound of water moving through the irrigation channels, the texture of mud under his feet, the way different sections of the farm smelled during different seasons. In the dream, Chin would wake up before dawn. not because servants were calling him to imperial duties, but because his body naturally responded to the rhythms of agricultural work. He would dress in simple cotton clothes that were comfortable for working in water and mud, eat a basic breakfast of rice and vegetables, and walk out to his paddies as the sun was rising over the hills. The physical sensation of walking into the rice paddies was something that Kangxi described with remarkable sensory detail. Dream Chun would step into ankle-deep water that was warm from absorbing yesterday's sunlight, feel the soft mud squishing between his toes, experience the slight resistance of water as he moved between the rows of young rice plants. Kangxi wrote that this simple physical experience, walking through muddy water in rice paddies, was more satisfying than any imperial ceremony he had ever participated in. The sensation was immediate, real, unmediated by protocol or political consideration. Qin's feet were in direct contact with the soil that sustained his life, the water that nourished his crops, the mud that would eventually become part of the rice that fed his family. Dream Chun understood his rice farm with scientific precision that amazed Kangxi, who despite his extensive education had never learned practical agricultural knowledge. Chun could predict weather patterns by the way morning mist moved across the paddies, could tell the health of his crop by the color and texture of individual rice leaves, could time the planting and harvesting perfectly by understanding seasonal changes that court astrologers never taught imperial students. When Dream Chun planted rice seedlings, he worked with his hands directly in the mud, transplanting young plants from nursery beds into flooded fields with careful attention to spacing, depth, and timing. The work was repetitive, but meditative: bend, dig, plant, move forward, repeat, creating a rhythm that allowed Chun's mind to rest while his body performed familiar, essential tasks. Kangxi described this physical work as profoundly peaceful in ways that intellectual activity never was. As emperor, Kangxi's mind was constantly analyzing political information, making complex decisions, anticipating future problems and opportunities. But Dream Chun's agricultural work allowed his consciousness to settle into the present moment, focused on immediate, tangible tasks that required attention but not anxiety. The seasonal cycles of rice farming provided Dream Chun with a natural structure for his year that Kangxi found deeply appealing. Chun's time was organized around planting season, growing season, and harvest season, each with its own specific tasks, challenges, and rewards. This natural calendar felt more meaningful to Kangxi than the artificial court calendar that structured his imperial life around political ceremonies and administrative obligations. During planting season, Dream Chun would spend long days in the paddies, transplanting seedlings while the weather was appropriate and the moon was in the correct phase for optimal growth. The work was urgent but not stressful. It had to be done within a specific time window, but the timeline was set by natural processes rather than human politics. Growing season brought different activities: maintaining irrigation channels, controlling weeds and pests, monitoring plant development, making adjustments based on weather patterns and crop health. Qin's days were filled with small, practical decisions that directly affected his family's food security and economic well-being. But harvest season was when Dream Chun found his greatest satisfaction. After months of careful tending, the rice would be ready to cut, dry, and thresh. Chun would work from sunrise to sunset, often with help from neighboring families, gathering the grain that would feed his household through the coming year. Kangxi wrote extensively about the emotional experience of Dream Chun's harvest work. When Chun cut mature rice stalks and felt their weight in his hands, when he watched golden grain falling from threshing baskets, when he calculated how much rice he had successfully grown, these moments provided satisfaction that Kangxi had never experienced in his imperial life. The rice that Chun harvested wasn't abstract wealth or political power. It was food, specific amounts of grain that would be eaten by specific people in specific meals throughout the year. Chun knew exactly how much rice his family needed to survive until the next harvest, how much could be sold to purchase other necessities, how much should be saved as seed for next year's planting. This direct connection between work and survival was completely different from Kangxi's imperial experience. As emperor, Kangxi's decisions affected millions of people and vast economic systems, but the consequences were always abstract and distant. Chun's agricultural work, by contrast, produced immediate, tangible results that directly supported his family's well-being. Dream Chun's relationship with his village community was another aspect of the dream that Kangxi found deeply appealing. The village where Chun lived was small enough that he knew every family personally, understood their individual circumstances, and participated in the complex web of mutual support that allowed rural communities to survive and prosper. During planting and harvest seasons, families would work together, sharing labor and equipment in carefully organized systems that had evolved over generations. When Chun needed extra hands to transplant seedlings quickly, his neighbors would help, knowing that he would reciprocate when their fields needed attention. When storms damaged someone's irrigation system, the whole village would contribute labor and materials to make repairs. Kangxi described these community work sessions as more emotionally satisfying than any court gathering he had ever attended. The village cooperation was based on genuine mutual need and authentic friendship, rather than political calculation or social advancement. People worked together because their survival depended on maintaining good relationships with neighbors, who lived similar lives and understood each other's challenges. The conversations that Dream Chun had with his fellow villagers were completely different from the careful, formal exchanges that dominated Kangxi's imperial social life. Village farmers could be completely honest about their concerns, hopes, and opinions because they didn't need to worry about political implications or court intrigue. Their discussions focused on practical matters, weather predictions, crop management techniques, family news, local events that affected everyone's daily life. Dream Chun also had a wife and children who related to him as a husband and father rather than as a political figure or source of patronage. Kangxi wrote about Dream Chun's family relationships with particular emotional intensity, suggesting that authentic family life was what he missed most in his imperial existence. Chun's wife, Mei, was described as a capable partner who managed household activities, helped with farm work during busy seasons, and shared in all the decisions that affected their family's well-being. When Chun and Mei talked in the evenings, they discussed real, immediate concerns, how their children were developing, whether they had adequate supplies for winter, which farming techniques seemed to be working best, how they could help neighbors who were facing difficulties. These conversations were collaborative and affectionate rather than formal or ceremonial. Mei could disagree with Chun's ideas, suggest alternative approaches, and participate as an equal partner in family decision-making. This was completely different from Kangxi's imperial family relationships, which were structured by court protocol and political considerations rather than by natural affection and shared responsibility. Dream Chun's children were integrated into farm life in ways that taught them practical skills while maintaining close family bonds. The children helped with age-appropriate agricultural tasks, learned farming techniques through direct participation, and understood that their family's survival depended on everyone contributing according to their abilities. Kangxi wrote about watching Dream Chun teach his son how to transplant rice seedlings, how to recognize signs of plant disease, how to repair irrigation channels. These teaching moments were intimate and practical, based on passing down essential life skills rather than abstract knowledge or political theory. When Dream Chun's daughter helped her mother with household tasks or learned to identify different varieties of rice, she was acquiring knowledge that would directly serve her throughout her adult life. The education was immediate, practical, and emotionally connected to family relationships rather than formal, academic, and politically motivated. The spiritual and philosophical aspects of Dream Chun's life also provided Kangxi with experiences that felt more authentic than the elaborate court religious ceremonies he participated in as emperor. Chun's spirituality was simple, practical, and integrated into daily agricultural work. Dream Chun would feel grateful for good weather, worried about potential droughts or floods, and connected to the natural cycles that governed agricultural success. His relationship with heaven and earth was direct and personal rather than mediated through court astrologers and official ceremonies. When Qing made offerings to ancestors or local deities, he was asking for practical help, adequate rainfall, protection from pests, good health for his family. His prayers were specific, immediate, and related to concerns that he understood from daily experience. This personal spirituality felt more genuine to Kangxi than the elaborate state religious observances that were designed to demonstrate imperial piety rather than express authentic faith. The seasonal festivals in Dreamchun's village were community celebrations that marked important agricultural transitions and brought families together for shared meals, traditional dances, and storytelling. These gatherings were warm, informal, and emotionally nourishing in ways that court entertainments never were. Kangxi described village festival scenes with particular fondness, families sharing food they had grown and prepared themselves, children playing traditional games, adults telling stories that connected present experiences to historical memories, everyone participating as equals in celebrations that had meaning for their shared community life. The contrast with imperial court ceremonies was stark. Court festivals were elaborate performances, designed to demonstrate political power and social hierarchy rather than express genuine community celebration. Participants were constantly aware of protocol, rank, and the need to behave appropriately for their political position rather than enjoying natural human fellowship. But perhaps the most psychologically significant aspect of Dreamchun's life was how it made. Kangxi questioned the value and meaning of imperial power. Chun had no political influence beyond his village, no ability to affect historical events, no legacy that would be remembered by future generations. But his life was filled with meaningful work, authentic relationships, and direct engagement with natural processes that sustained human life. Kangxi began to wonder whether his imperial responsibilities were actually preventing him from experiencing the kinds of activities and relationships that create genuine satisfaction and personal peace. Dreamchun was materially poor but rich in exactly the experiences that Kangxi found himself longing for: useful work, authentic family life, genuine community connection, direct relationship with the natural world. This psychological conflict led to the bizarre and historically significant decision that made Kangxi's dream farmer obsession a political crisis. He began asking his courtiers detailed questions about agriculture, not the abstract economic questions that emperors typically asked about agricultural policy, but specific, practical questions about rice cultivation, seasonal timing, soil management, and harvest techniques. The courtiers were baffled and alarmed. Why would the Son of Heaven need to know how to plant rice? It was beneath his divine status to concern himself with such mundane matters. But Kangxi persisted, eventually summoning actual farmers to the Forbidden City to teach him agricultural methods. Imagine the scene: the Emperor of China in his magnificent throne room, surrounded by golden dragons and priceless artifacts, asking peasant farmers to show him how to properly transplant rice seedlings. The farmers were terrified, convinced this was some kind of test that could result in their execution if they answered incorrectly. But Kangxi's interest was genuine and obsessive. He had gardens created within the Forbidden City where he could practice farming techniques that Dreamchun had performed so effortlessly. He insisted on eating only rice that he had personally planted and harvested, claiming that it tasted different, more real, more satisfying than the elaborate imperial cuisine prepared by court chefs. The political implications of the emperor's agricultural obsession were enormous. In Chinese imperial culture, the emperor's interests and activities were interpreted as cosmic signs. If the Son of Heaven was suddenly focused on farming, what did this mean for the mandate of heaven? Was he preparing for some catastrophic change that would require everyone to return to agricultural subsistence? Court astrologers worked overtime trying to interpret Kangxi's behavior. Some suggested that the emperor was receiving divine messages about upcoming famines or climate disasters. Others worried that his interest in peasant life indicated that the dynasty was losing its heavenly mandate and that political upheaval was inevitable. The succession implications were even more complex. Kangxi had multiple sons who were potential heirs, and they began positioning themselves differently based on their father's new agricultural interests. Some princes started learning farming techniques, thinking this might be the key to winning imperial favor. Others argued that the emperor's peasant obsession was a sign of mental decline and that succession should happen immediately. What makes Kangxi's story particularly poignant is how his dream inspired agricultural experiments affected his understanding of imperial power. In his journals, he wrote that learning to grow rice taught him how little he actually knew about the foundation of his empire. He realized that his power depended entirely on the agricultural work of millions of farmers, but he had never understood or appreciated the complexity and skill required for that work. Kenshi also wrote about the satisfaction he felt when eating rice he had grown himself, compared to the elaborate imperial banquets that had been prepared for him throughout his life. He described the simple rice as tasting like accomplished work rather than inherited privilege. The emperor's dream farmer obsession lasted for about 2 years, during which time he continued ruling effectively but spent every available moment learning agricultural techniques and working in his palace gardens. Court officials eventually convinced him that his farming experiments were causing political instability, and he gradually returned to more conventional imperial activities. But Kangxi never forgot his dream of being Chun the rice farmer. In his final years, he often said that if reincarnation was real, he hoped to be born as a farmer rather than as an emperor. He wanted to experience the life where work and results were directly connected, where the success of his efforts could be measured in rice bowls filled rather than in territories conquered. When Kenshi died in 1722, among his personal possessions were simple farming tools and bags of rice seed that he had saved from his palace gardens. It's like he was trying to take pieces of his dream life with him, or maybe preparing for a next life where he could finally be Chun instead of Kangxi. The historical irony is that Kangxi is remembered as one of China's greatest emperors, but his private writings suggest that he found more personal meaning in growing rice than in ruling an empire. Sometimes the lives we're meant to live and the lives we actually live are completely different things, and our dreams are the only place where we get to experience the path not taken. Queen Christina of Sweden, one of the most educated and intellectually curious monarchs in European history, who abdicated her throne at age 28 to pursue philosophy and religious studies, had a series of dreams in 1651 that essentially showed her an alternative life so appealing that she spent 3 years trying to make it reality, even if it meant abandoning one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. Christina's dreams were different from the agricultural fantasies of other royal dreamers. She dreamed she was Anna, a shepherdess living alone in a small stone cottage in the Swedish mountains, spending her days walking through forests and meadows with a small flock of sheep, completely free from human politics and social obligations. What made Dream Anna's life so compelling to Christina wasn't just the simplicity, it was the intellectual freedom. As queen, Christina was surrounded by scholars, philosophers, and artists, but every intellectual conversation was filtered through court politics and diplomatic considerations. She could never explore ideas purely for their own sake, because every opinion she expressed had potential political consequences. Let me paint you the picture of what Anna's world looked like, because Christina documented these dreams with the obsessive detail of someone who had found something more precious than all the crown jewels in Europe. The stone cottage where Dream Anna lived was perched on a hillside overlooking vast meadows that stretched toward distant mountains. It was small, just 2 rooms with thick stone walls and a slate roof, but it was perfectly positioned to catch morning sunlight and afternoon breezes. The cottage had been built by previous shepherds over many generations, each adding improvements that made it more functional and comfortable. Anna inherited not just a building, but a tradition of solitary mountain life that had been refined through centuries of people, who chose isolation and simplicity over social complexity and material accumulation. Inside the cottage, everything was functional and beautiful in its simplicity. A stone fireplace provided heat and cooking facilities, with a wooden mantel where Anna kept a few precious books, poetry, philosophy, natural history, that she had acquired through rare visits to distant towns. A simple wooden table served for meals and writing, positioned by a window that looked out over the meadows where her sheep grazed. The sleeping area was just an alcove with a straw mattress and woolen blankets that Anna had woven herself from her sheep's wool. No elaborate bedchamber, no silk hangings, no servants to attend to her comfort. Just the basic elements needed for rest after days of physical activity and mountain air. But here's what made this dream so psychologically revolutionary for Christina. Dreamlana lived in a world of pure thought and observation. She spent long days alone with her sheep, watching weather patterns, seasonal changes, animal behavior, the movement of stars across the sky. Her mind was completely free to wander, to make connections between ideas, to pursue philosophical questions without any external pressure or agenda. In the dreams, Anna would spend hours sitting on hillsides, watching her sheep graze while contemplating questions about the nature of existence, the meaning of life, the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world. She had no libraries, no scholars to consult, no ancient texts to reference, just her own mind, her observations, and unlimited time to think. Christina described these thinking sessions as intellectually intoxicating. Dreamlana could follow a philosophical idea for days or weeks, allowing thoughts to develop naturally without the interruptions of royal duties, court ceremonies, diplomatic meetings, or political crises. The mental freedom was so complete and satisfying that Christina would sometimes wake up disappointed to find herself back in the complex, demanding world of Swedish politics. The sheep in Anna's dreams became symbolic of the kind of responsibility that Christina found appealing, caring for living beings without political complications. Unlike ruling subjects who had competing interests, political agendas, and complex needs that often conflicted with each other, caring for sheep was straightforward. Keep them fed, keep them safe, guide them to good pasture, protect them from predators. Simple, direct, meaningful work with clear moral boundaries. Anna's daily routine began before dawn, when she would wake naturally to the sound of her sheep stirring outside the cottage. She would dress in practical woolen clothes that she had made herself, eat a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and milk, and lead her flock out of their nighttime enclosure to begin the day's grazing. The physical experience of shepherding was something that Christina found deeply appealing after years of sedentary court life. Dreamlana walked for miles every day, following her sheep across mountain meadows, through forest clearings, along streams and valleys that provided the variety of vegetation that kept the flock healthy and well-fed. This constant movement through natural landscapes gave Anna intimate knowledge of the mountain environment that Christina had never experienced despite her extensive education. Anna knew which meadows provided the best grazing at different times of year, which streams were reliable sources of clean water, which weather signs indicated approaching storms that required shelter. But the walking wasn't just practical, it was meditative. As Anna moved through the mountains with her sheep, her mind would settle into rhythms of observation and contemplation that allowed deep philosophical thinking. The physical activity was repetitive enough to be calming, but varied enough to keep her alert and engaged with her environment. Christina wrote extensively about the intellectual insights that Dreamlana developed during these long walks. Without access to books or scholarly discussions, Anna learned to think originally and independently about fundamental questions that had occupied philosophers for centuries. Her conclusions might not have been academically sophisticated, but they were genuine, personally earned, and free from the intellectual fashions and political pressures that influenced court scholarly discussions. Anna's relationship with her sheep was another aspect of the dream that Christina found psychologically satisfying. Each sheep had its own personality, habits, and needs that Anna learned to understand and accommodate. Some were leaders who could be trusted to guide the flock to good grazing areas. Others were followers who needed more supervision. Others were independents who required careful watching to prevent them from wandering away. This individual attention to the sheep represented the kind of personal, immediate responsibility that Christina found more meaningful than ruling millions of subjects she would never meet. Anna knew each of her sheep personally, their health problems, their behavioral quirks, their relationships with other members of the flock. When decisions needed to be made about the sheep's welfare, Anna could base them on direct observation and personal knowledge rather than abstract policy considerations. The seasonal rhythms of shepherding provided Anna's life with natural structure that Christina found more satisfying than the artificial court calendar. In spring, Anna would help with lambing, watching over pregnant ewes, and caring for newborns with the intense attention that birth and early life require. In summer, she would move the flock to high mountain pastures, living in temporary shelters while the sheep took advantage of rich alpine grasses. Fall brought shearing time, when Anna would carefully remove each sheep's wool and begin the long process of cleaning, spinning, and weaving that would produce cloth for her own clothing and blankets. Winter required moving the flock to sheltered areas and supplementing natural grazing with stored hay and grain. These seasonal activities connected Anna to natural cycles in ways that court life never did. Her year was organized around biological necessities and environmental changes rather than political ceremonies and administrative obligations. The work was demanding but predictable, following patterns that had been established by countless generations of shepherds who had lived similar lives in the same mountains. Christina also wrote about the crafts that Dream Anna practiced during quiet periods, particularly the long winter evenings when the sheep were safely sheltered and there was time for indoor activities. Anna would spin wool into thread, weave cloth on a simple loom, make cheese from sheep's milk, preserve food for lean seasons, and create the various household items needed for independent mountain life. These crafts provided Anna with skills that directly supported her survival and comfort. Unlike the decorative arts that Christina practiced as queen, painting, music, embroidery, which were primarily designed to demonstrate cultural sophistication, Anna's crafts were functional and necessary. Every piece of cloth she wove, every tool she made, every food item she preserved contributed directly to her ability to live independently in her mountain cottage. The intellectual dimension of Dream Anna's life was perhaps what attracted Christina most strongly. Without the distractions of court social life, diplomatic obligations, or administrative responsibilities, Anna had unlimited time for reading and thinking. She would spend entire afternoons absorbed in philosophical texts, following complex arguments at her own pace without interruption. But Anna's intellectual life wasn't just solitary reading. She would spend hours writing in journals, recording her thoughts about books she had read, observations about natural phenomena, philosophical insights that developed during her long walks with the sheep. This writing was private, personal, and free from any consideration of how it might be received by critics or political opponents. Christina described Anna's intellectual freedom as intoxicating. Dream Anna could think heretical thoughts, explore controversial ideas, question established authorities, and develop original philosophical positions without any concern about political consequences or social disapproval. Her intellectual life was completely authentic, driven by genuine curiosity and personal conviction rather than by strategic considerations or career advancement. The isolation of Anna's mountain life also provided experiences that Christina found spiritually enriching. Without the constant social stimulation of court life, Anna developed a deeper relationship with her own consciousness, learning to find satisfaction in solitude rather than depending on external validation or entertainment. Anna would spend hours in contemplative silence, watching sunrise and sunset from her cottage, observing the changing patterns of weather and light that marked the passage of days and seasons. This regular contact with natural beauty and cosmic rhythms provided spiritual nourishment that Christina had never found in elaborate court religious ceremonies. The dreams also included scenes of Anna's rare interactions with other people, occasional visits to distant villages to purchase supplies, encounters with other shepherds during seasonal migrations, brief conversations with travelers who passed through the mountains. These social interactions were simple, honest, and refreshing after months of solitude. When Anna did talk with other people, the conversations were natural and unguarded. She could be completely herself, expressing genuine opinions and emotions without concern about protocol, political implications, or social advancement. These brief human connections felt more authentic and satisfying to Christina than the elaborate social interactions that filled her court life. Christina became so obsessed with these shepherdess dreams that she began making radical changes to her actual life. She started spending more time outdoors, often walking alone in the palace gardens or nearby forests. She reduced her participation in court ceremonies, delegating many royal duties to advisors, so she could have more time for solitary thinking. Most dramatically, Christina began divesting herself of royal wealth and possessions. She gave away jewelry, expensive clothing, and luxury items, claiming that they were distractions from more important pursuits. She started wearing simpler clothes and eating simpler meals, trying to approximate the uncomplicated lifestyle that Dreamland enjoyed. The Swedish court was alarmed by their queen's behavior. Christina had always been unconventional. She was highly educated, interested in philosophy and science, and had no desire to marry or produce heirs. But her dream-inspired rejection of royal materialism seemed to threaten the stability of the monarchy itself. Foreign diplomats reported back to their governments that the Swedish queen appeared to be having some kind of spiritual crisis that might affect international relations. Christina's rejection of royal luxury was interpreted as a possible sign that Sweden was facing economic problems or that the queen was preparing for military conflict that would require national sacrifice. Here's where Christina's story becomes truly extraordinary. She actually tried to implement her shepherdess dreams on a royal scale. In 1652, she announced plans to distribute much of the royal treasury to Swedish citizens, particularly rural farmers and herders, claiming that wealth was more meaningful when it supported people who did essential work rather than decorative courtiers. Christina also proposed creating what she called contemplation retreats, simple buildings in remote areas where scholars and philosophers could live like hermits, pursuing pure knowledge without institutional pressures or material distractions. She wanted to fund these retreats with money that had previously been used for court entertainment and royal ceremonies. The Swedish parliament was horrified. They couldn't allow their queen to give away the kingdom's wealth to pursue philosophical fantasies inspired by dreams about sheep. A series of intense political negotiations ensued, with parliament members trying to convince Christina to abandon her shepherdess-inspired reforms, while she argued that her dreams had shown her a better way to organize society. The conflict eventually became unsustainable. Christina realized that she couldn't transform Sweden into a nation of contemplative shepherds, but she also couldn't ignore the profound truth that her dreams had revealed about what would make her personally happy and intellectually fulfilled. So she made the most radical decision in royal history. She abdicated the throne at age 28, converted to Catholicism, which was illegal in Protestant Sweden, and left the country to pursue the kind of intellectual and spiritual freedom that Dream Anna had shown her. Christina spent the rest of her life moving between different European cities, living relatively simply, engaging with philosophers and artists on her own terms rather than as part of royal obligations. She never became an actual shepherdess, but she created a life that captured the intellectual freedom and simplicity that her dreams had made so appealing. In her later writings, Christina described her abdication as choosing to live in the real world the way Dream Anna had lived in the dream world, free from artificial social expectations, able to pursue ideas purely for their intrinsic value, responsible only for her own conscience and intellectual integrity. Christina died in 1689, never having regretted her decision to give up the Swedish throne. Her final writings include references to dreams about sheep and mountains, suggesting that the shepherdess dreams continued throughout her life, providing ongoing confirmation that she had made the right choice in prioritizing personal authenticity over political power. Makes you wonder about the relationship between external success and internal satisfaction, doesn't it? Christina had everything that most people think would make them happy: power, wealth, education, admiration, but she gave it all up because her dreams showed her that none of it was what she actually wanted. Sometimes our subconscious mind knows things about us that our conscious mind hasn't figured out yet. Emperor Shah Jahan, the guy who built the Taj Mahal as a monument to his love for his wife Mumtaz, had a recurring dream starting in 1645 that showed him living as Rahul, a simple potter in a small village near the Yamuna River. But this wasn't just another "what if I were poor" fantasy. These dreams revealed something profound about creativity, legacy, and the relationship between art and authenticity that completely changed how Shah Jahan understood his role as both emperor and creator. In his dreams, Potter Rahul worked with clay every day, creating simple vessels that people in his village used for cooking, storing water, and carrying grain. The pots weren't decorated with precious stones or intricate patterns. They were functional, beautiful in their simplicity, and made entirely by Rahul's hands using techniques passed down through generations of potters. Now, let me tell you exactly what Rahul's world looked like. Because Shah Jahan documented these dreams with the intensity of someone who had discovered a completely different way of understanding what it meant to create something meaningful. Rahul lived in a small mud brick house with a thatched roof, located on the outskirts of a village where the Yamuna River curved through agricultural fields and mango groves. The house was simple but perfectly designed for pottery work. The main room contained Rahul's potter's wheel, a heavy stone disc that could be spun by foot while hands shaped clay, positioned near a window that provided good natural light for detailed work. Along the walls were wooden shelves holding finished pots in various stages of drying, and clay vessels filled with different types of clay that Rahul had collected from riverbanks and hillsides. Behind the house was a covered courtyard where Rahul stored larger pottery pieces and operated his kiln, a carefully constructed oven made of brick and clay that could reach the high temperatures needed to transform soft clay into durable ceramic. The kiln was Rahul's most important tool, and he had built it himself using knowledge that his father had taught him, which his grandfather had taught his father, stretching back through centuries of village potters. What made these dreams so psychologically transformative for Shah Jahan was the direct relationship between Dream Rahul's work and its use. When Rahul created a water jug, he would later see that specific jug being used by a specific family to carry water from the river. When he made cooking pots, he would encounter them months later in village homes, seasoned and stained from years of preparing family meals. This was completely different from Shah Jahan's experience as emperor creating monumental architecture. The Taj Mahal was magnificent, but it was also essentially a tomb, beautiful but static, removed from daily life. The Red Fort was imposing and politically important, but most of the people in his empire would never see it, let alone use it in their daily lives. Dream Rahul's pottery, by contrast, became part of people's most intimate daily experiences. His water jugs touched their lips every day. His cooking pots fed their families. His storage vessels kept their grain safe through lean seasons. The pottery became integrated into the texture of ordinary life in ways that imperial monuments never could. Shah Jahan became fascinated by the spiritual implications of this difference. In Islamic philosophy, there's a concept called baraka, divine blessing, that flows through meaningful work and genuine service to others. In his dreams, Potter Rahul's work was infused with baraka because it directly served human needs without any ego or self-aggrandizement involved. Rahul's daily routine began before dawn, when he would walk to the riverbank to collect clay. Different sections of the river provided clay with different properties. Some was better for water vessels because it remained cool. Others was ideal for cooking pots because it distributed heat evenly. Others was perfect for storage jars because it hardened into particularly durable ceramic. Shah Jahan described the sensory experience of Dream Rahul collecting clay with remarkable detail. Rahul would wade into the shallow water at river bends where fine clay had been deposited by seasonal floods, feeling with his feet for patches that had the right texture and consistency. He would scoop clay into leather bags, testing small samples between his fingers to judge plasticity and checking for impurities that would need to be removed. This intimate knowledge of raw materials was completely different from Shah Jahan's imperial experience with construction materials. As emperor, Shah Jahan could command the finest marble, the most precious stones, the most skilled craftsmen from across his empire. But he never touched the materials himself, never learned their properties through direct experience, never understood how their characteristics affected the final products. Dream Rahul's relationship with clay was personal and scientific. He knew which clay would shrink more during firing, which would develop certain colors when exposed to different kiln temperatures, which combinations would produce the strongest finished pottery. This knowledge came from years of hands-on experimentation rather than from theoretical study or administrative reports. Back at his workshop, Rahul would prepare clay for pottery by removing impurities, adding temper materials like sand or crushed pottery to improve workability, and aging clay mixtures that developed better plasticity over time. These preparatory processes required patience and attention to detail that Shah Jahan found meditative and satisfying. The actual pottery-making process was where Dream Rahul found his greatest creative fulfillment. Sitting at his potter's wheel, Rahul would center a ball of clay and begin shaping it with subtle pressure from his hands, while the wheel spun steadily beneath. Shah Jahan described this process as almost magical, watching shapeless clay transform into functional vessels through the combination of spinning motion, careful pressure, and skilled intention. What made pottery work so appealing to Shah Jahan was its immediate responsiveness. If Rahul applied too much pressure, the clay would collapse. If his hands were unsteady, the pot would be uneven. If he misjudged the clay's moisture content, the vessel would crack or distort. The work required complete attention and provided instant feedback about the quality of technique. This was completely different from imperial architecture projects, where Shah Jahan's design decisions were implemented by thousands of workers over years or decades, with results that might not be apparent until long after the initial conception. Dream Rahul's pottery provided immediate, tactile confirmation of successful or unsuccessful technique. Each pot that Rahul created was unique, shaped by the specific conditions of its making, the particular clay used, the weather affecting drying rates, the exact temperature achieved in the kiln, the position of the piece during firing. No two vessels were identical, yet all served their intended functions effectively. This combination of uniqueness and utility fascinated Shah Jahan, who was accustomed to imperial projects that emphasized uniformity and grandeur. Rahul's pottery also required him to understand and work with natural processes that couldn't be controlled or hurried. Clay had to dry slowly to prevent cracking. Kiln firing required precise timing and temperature control. Glazes developed unpredictable patterns that added beauty but couldn't be exactly reproduced. This cooperation with natural forces rather than domination of them provided a different model of creativity than the imperial approach of imposing human will on massive scales. The social aspects of Rahul's pottery work were another element that Shah Jahan found deeply meaningful. When villagers came to commission pottery, they would discuss their specific needs, the size of water jug that worked best for their family, the shape of cooking pot that fit their particular stove, the type of storage vessel needed for different grains or liquids. These conversations were collaborative and practical rather than ceremonial or deferential. Customers treated Rahul as a skilled craftsman whose expertise they respected, and they provided feedback about how well previous pottery had served their needs. This direct connection between maker and user created a feedback loop that continuously improved Rahul's work. Shah Jahan contrasted this with his experience commissioning imperial architecture, where architects and builders were required to defer to his wishes regardless of technical or practical considerations. Imperial projects were designed to impress rather than to serve specific user needs, and feedback about functionality was filtered through layers of court hierarchy rather than coming directly from people who used the buildings. Dream Rahul's pottery business also operated on principles of fair exchange that Shah Jahan found morally satisfying. Rahul set prices based on the time and skill required to create each piece, the cost of materials, and the value that pottery provided to users. Customers paid willingly because they understood the work involved and appreciated the quality of the finished products. This honest economic relationship was completely different from the imperial tax system that funded Shah Jahan's architectural projects. Imperial revenue came from taxes that subjects were required to pay regardless of whether they benefited directly from royal expenditures. The Taj Mahal was paid for by people who would never see it, built to glorify an emperor rather than serve the people who funded its construction. Rahul's seasonal work patterns also provided experiences that Shah Jahan found appealing. During monsoon season, when clay was abundant and demand for water storage vessels increased, Rahul would work long days creating pottery for the coming dry season. During harvest time, he would focus on large storage jars needed to preserve grain. During festival seasons, he would create decorative pieces that families used for special occasions. This natural rhythm of work responding to seasonal needs and community activities felt more meaningful to Shah Jahan than the artificial court calendar that structured his imperial life. Rahul's pottery work was integrated into the annual cycles that governed village life, while imperial ceremonies and administrative obligations followed political rather than natural rhythms. The firing process was perhaps the most spiritually significant aspect of Rahul's pottery work for Shah Jahan. Loading the kiln required careful arrangement of pottery pieces to ensure even heating. Managing the fire required constant attention for many hours, and the final results weren't revealed until the kiln had cooled completely. This process of transformation, soft clay becoming hard ceramic through the application of fire, provided powerful metaphors for spiritual development that resonated with Shah Jahan's Islamic beliefs. The pottery emerged from the kiln fundamentally changed, stronger, and more durable, marked by the fire it had passed through but not destroyed by it. Shah Jahan wrote about the excitement and anxiety of opening the kiln after firing, never knowing exactly how the pottery would look or whether pieces had survived the intense heat. Some pots would crack, others would develop beautiful, unexpected colors or patterns, others would emerge exactly as planned. This element of uncertainty and surprise made each firing an adventure rather than a routine production process. The community relationships that surrounded Rahul's pottery work provided another dimension of satisfaction that Shah Jahan's imperial life lacked. During kiln firings, neighbors would often gather to help load pottery, maintain the fire, and celebrate successful results. These work sessions became social occasions that strengthened village bonds and shared knowledge between generations. Older potters would share techniques with younger ones. Families would help each other during busy seasons, and successful firings would be celebrated with shared meals and storytelling. This integration of work and community life created relationships based on mutual support and shared purpose rather than hierarchy and competition. But here's what made these dreams truly revolutionary for Shah Jahan. He began to question whether his imperial projects, despite their beauty and grandeur, were actually expressions of spiritual creativity or just elaborate monuments to his own ego. The Taj Mahal was supposed to honor his beloved wife, but was it really about love? Or was it about demonstrating his power to create something so magnificent that it would make people remember him as a great ruler? Dream Rahul never signed his pottery or expected recognition for his work. People used his pots without thinking about who had made them, and this anonymity felt spiritually pure in a way that Shah Jahan's monumental architecture never did. The potter's work served people. The emperor's work impressed people. And the dream suggested that service was more meaningful than impression. This spiritual crisis led Shah Jahan to start doing something that shocked the Mughal court. He began working with clay. Initially, he told his advisors that he was studying pottery as a way of understanding the crafts that supported his empire's economy. But his private journals reveal that he was actually trying to access the spiritual satisfaction that Dream Rahul experienced through direct, functional creativity. The emperor set up a potter's wheel in a private section of his palace and spent hours learning to shape clay with his own hands. His first attempts were clumsy and uneven. Imagine the guy who commissioned the Taj Mahal struggling to create a simple, functional bowl. But Shah Jahan persisted, finding something deeply meditative and satisfying about the process. As his pottery skills improved, Shah Jahan began creating vessels for use in the palace kitchens and daily ceremonies. He insisted that his handmade pots be used for actual functions rather than displayed as curiosities. The court was bewildered by their emperor's insistence that they drink from crude clay, cups that he had made rather than from jeweled goblets worth more than most people's annual income. But the most remarkable aspect of Shah Jahan's potter dreams was how they influenced his later architectural projects. After 1645, his building designs became simpler, more focused on function and human scale rather than pure monumentality. He commissioned community projects, wells, caravanserais, local mosques that served ordinary people's daily needs rather than just impressing visitors with imperial grandeur. Shah Jahan also changed how he thought about artistic legacy. Instead of focusing solely on massive projects that would make his name immortal, he began supporting anonymous craftsmen and artisans. providing resources for local pottery workshops, textile studios, and metalworking centers that produced beautiful, functional items for everyday use. In his later writings, Shah Jahan described this shift as moving from ego architecture to service architecture. He realized that the most spiritually meaningful creative work was often invisible, the potter whose bowls became part of family traditions, the weaver whose cloth kept people warm, the metalsmith whose tools helped farmers grow food. The emperor's potter dreams continued throughout his life, and he continued practicing pottery until his death. Among his personal effects, archaeologists found dozens of simple clay vessels that he had made himself, alongside detailed journals where he reflected on the spiritual dimensions of functional creativity versus monumental art. Here's what I find most beautiful about Shah Jahan's story. He never stopped being an emperor or building magnificent structures, but his dreams taught him to understand his imperial creativity in service terms rather than ego terms. The later buildings of his reign were designed not just to demonstrate royal power, but to serve the spiritual and practical needs of his people. Shah Jahan's potter dream suggests that sometimes our subconscious shows us alternative versions of ourselves, not to make us dissatisfied with our actual lives, but to help us understand the deeper spiritual principles that should guide whatever work we're already doing. Dream Rahul didn't replace Emperor Shah Jahan, but he taught the emperor how to approach creativity with humility, service, and authentic spiritual purpose. Makes you think about the difference between creating things to impress people versus creating things to serve people, doesn't it? Sometimes our dreams show us that the same hands can do both, but the motivation makes all the difference in terms of spiritual satisfaction and lasting meaning. King Frederick I of Prussia, the guy who transformed a collection of German territories into a unified kingdom and established the foundation for what would eventually become modern Germany, had a series of dreams in 1705. That was so philosophically disturbing, they almost caused him to question whether he was actually a king dreaming about being a woodsman, or a woodsman dreaming about being a king. Frederick's dreams were different from the agricultural or craft-focused dreams of other monarchs. He dreamed he was Wilhelm, a woodsman living alone in a small cabin deep in the Black Forest, spending his days cutting timber, maintaining forest paths, and living in complete harmony with the natural rhythms of the forest ecosystem. What made these dreams psychologically complex for Frederick was their internal consistency and detail. Dream Wilhelm had memories that stretched back years, specific storms that had felled particular trees, seasonal patterns that affected different parts of the forest, relationships with forest animals that had developed over time. The dream life felt as historically complete and psychologically real as Frederick's actual memories of being king. Let me tell you exactly what Wilhelm's world looked like. Because Frederick documented these dreams with the obsessive detail of someone trying to solve a philosophical puzzle about the nature of reality itself, Wilhelm lived in a log cabin that he had built himself using trees. He had carefully selected and felled from different parts of the forest. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by ancient oak, beech, and pine trees that formed a natural cathedral of living pillars stretching up toward patches of sky. The cabin was small but perfectly functional, one main room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft accessible by a wooden ladder, and a workshop area where Wilhelm maintained his tools and equipment. Every piece of furniture had been crafted by Wilhelm's own hands using wood from the surrounding forest, and every tool had been chosen or modified specifically for forest work. Outside the cabin, Wilhelm had created a complex system of paths, clearings, and work areas that allowed him to manage different sections of the forest for optimal health and productivity. Some areas were left completely wild to serve as habitat for animals and birds. Others were selectively thinned to encourage the growth of valuable timber species. Others were maintained as sources of firewood, medicinal plants, and food. But here's what made Wilhelm's dream life so philosophically compelling to Frederick. It was a world where wisdom came from direct observation and experience rather than from books, advisors, or political analysis. Wilhelm learned by watching, listening, touching, testing. His knowledge was practical, immediate, and always reliable because it was based on natural laws rather than human politics. In the dreams, Wilhelm would wake before dawn not because servants were calling him to royal duties, but because his body naturally responded to the rhythms of forest life. He would dress in practical woolen clothes that he had woven himself from sheep that grazed in forest meadows, eat a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and herbal tea, and walk out into the forest as morning light began filtering through the canopy. The physical sensation of moving through the forest was something that Frederick described with almost mystical reverence. Dream Wilhelm could navigate through dense woodland in complete darkness using only sounds, smells, and the feel of air currents on his skin. He knew every tree, every rock, every stream in his territory with an intimacy that made him feel like part of the forest, ecosystem rather than separate from it. Frederick was a highly educated king who spoke multiple languages, studied philosophy and mathematics, and corresponded with leading European intellectuals. But his intellectual knowledge often felt abstract and disconnected from reality. Political theories might work on paper, but fail in practice. Diplomatic strategies might seem logical but produce unexpected consequences. Military plans might be tactically sound but fail because of weather, terrain, or human factors that couldn't be predicted from maps and reports. Dream Wilhelm, by contrast, lived in a world where cause and effect were direct and reliable. If you cut a tree incorrectly, it would fall in the wrong direction, immediately, obviously, with clear consequences. If you didn't properly maintain your cabin before winter, you would be cold, directly, personally, with no one else to blame. If you overcut in one section of forest, the ecosystem would become unbalanced, visibly, measurably in ways that taught you to work more carefully in the future. Wilhelm's daily work in the forest provided Frederick with experiences of authentic competence that royal life never offered. When Wilhelm selected trees for cutting, he considered dozens of factors: the tree's age and health, its position in the forest canopy, the effect its removal would have on surrounding trees, the quality of timber it would provide, the best season for cutting to minimize ecological disruption. These decisions required deep knowledge that Wilhelm had developed through years of careful observation and experimentation. He could judge a tree's internal health by examining its bark, leaves, and growth patterns. He could predict how a tree would fall based on its lean, the distribution of its branches, and the direction of prevailing winds. He could time his cutting to take advantage of seasonal changes in sap flow and wood density. Frederick described Wilhelm's tree-felling work with remarkable technical detail, suggesting that these dreams provided him with knowledge he had never consciously acquired. Wilhelm would study a tree for days before cutting it, planning the exact sequence of cuts that would allow him to control its fall precisely. He would clear escape routes, position his tools strategically, and make his cuts with careful attention to angle, depth, and timing. When the tree finally fell, Wilhelm could predict exactly where it would land, how much noise it would make, and what effect its removal would have on the surrounding forest. This level of precision and predictability was completely different from Frederick's royal experience, where political decisions often had unintended consequences that emerged months or years later through complex chains of cause and effect. The processing of felled trees was another aspect of Wilhelm's work that Frederick found deeply satisfying. Wilhelm would limb and section each tree carefully, sorting different parts for different uses, the straightest sections for construction timber, smaller branches for firewood, bark for tanning leather, sawdust for various household purposes. Nothing was wasted, and every part of the tree found its appropriate use. This complete utilization of resources felt morally superior to Frederick's experience with royal consumption, where luxury and waste were often displays of power rather than efficient use of available materials. Wilhelm's forest work was guided by principles of sustainability and respect for natural resources rather than by desires to impress others with abundance. Wilhelm's relationship with forest animals was another dimension of the dreams that Frederick found philosophically significant. Wilhelm knew the behavioral patterns, seasonal habits, and individual personalities of the deer, wild boar, birds, and smaller creatures that lived in his forest territory. He could predict where different animals would be at different times, what they needed for survival, and how his forest management activities would affect their well-being. This knowledge created a sense of responsibility that Frederick found more meaningful than ruling human subjects. Wilhelm's decisions about which trees to cut, which areas to leave undisturbed, and how to manage forest resources were guided by consideration for the animals that depended on the forest ecosystem. The responsibility was immediate, personal, and based on direct observation rather than abstract policy considerations. When Wilhelm encountered injured animals or orphaned young, he would provide care based on practical knowledge of forest medicine and animal behavior. He knew which plants had healing properties, how to set broken bones, how to feed different species during their vulnerable early stages. This direct hands-on caretaking felt more genuine to Frederick than the elaborate charitable ceremonies that royal life required. The seasonal rhythms of Wilhelm's forest work provided structure that Frederick found more natural and satisfying than the artificial court calendar. In spring, Wilhelm would assess winter damage, plant new trees in areas that needed reforestation, and prepare trails and work areas for the active season ahead. In summer, he would do most of his cutting and construction work, taking advantage of good weather and long daylight hours. Fall brought the harvest season, when Wilhelm would gather nuts, berries, medicinal plants, and other forest products that would sustain him through winter. He would also complete preparations for cold weather, storing firewood, preserving food, and winterizing his cabin and outbuildings. Winter was a time for indoor work, making and repairing tools, planning next year's forest management activities, and studying the forest during its dormant season. These seasonal cycles connected Wilhelm's work to natural processes that operated according to biological and environmental laws rather than human political considerations. Frederick found this natural calendar more meaningful than the court ceremonies and administrative obligations that structured his royal life according to artificial traditions and diplomatic requirements. Wilhelm's craftsmanship was another aspect of the dreams that Frederick found deeply appealing. Wilhelm made all his own tools, furniture, and household items using materials from the forest and techniques that he had developed through experimentation and practice. His workshop contained hand tools that he had forged himself, woodworking equipment that he had designed for specific forest tasks, and projects in various stages of completion. The quality of Wilhelm's craftwork was determined by its functionality rather than its appearance or cost. A chair that Wilhelm made would be comfortable, durable, and perfectly suited to its intended use, even if it lacked the decorative elements that characterized royal furniture. Tools that Wilhelm crafted would perform their functions reliably for decades, even if they weren't as elaborate as the ceremonial weapons and implements that surrounded Frederick's court life. This focus on function over form represented a different aesthetic philosophy that Frederick found intellectually appealing. Wilhelm created beauty through perfection of purpose rather than through expensive materials or elaborate decoration. A well-made axe that balanced perfectly in Wilhelm's hand and cut cleanly through wood was more beautiful to him than a jeweled sword that existed primarily for ceremonial display. Wilhelm's food and cooking were equally focused on simplicity and nutrition rather than luxury and impression. Wilhelm would eat what the forest provided, game that he hunted and trapped, fish from forest streams, wild plants that he gathered seasonally, vegetables from a small garden that he maintained in a sunny clearing. His diet changed with the seasons, providing variety while keeping him connected to natural cycles. The preparation of meals was also simple and practical. Wilhelm would cook over an open fire, using basic techniques that concentrated on preserving nutritional value and natural flavors rather than creating elaborate presentations. Frederick described Wilhelm's meals as more satisfying than the complex court cuisine that was prepared for royal banquets. Despite being much simpler in preparation and ingredients, this preference for simple, authentic food over elaborate, artificial cuisine became another point of philosophical reflection for Frederick. Wilhelm's meals were honest. They represented real nourishment obtained through Wilhelm's own work and knowledge. Royal banquets, by contrast, were performances designed to demonstrate wealth and cultural sophistication rather than to provide genuine sustenance. Wilhelm's solitude was perhaps the most psychologically significant aspect of the dreams for Frederick. Wilhelm lived alone by choice, finding companionship in his relationship with the forest rather than in human social interaction. He could go for weeks without talking to another person, but he never felt lonely because he was constantly engaged with the complex, living ecosystem that surrounded his cabin. This solitude provided Wilhelm with mental clarity and emotional peace that Frederick had never experienced despite being constantly surrounded by courtiers, advisors, and social obligations. Wilhelm's thoughts were his own, undisturbed by political pressure, social expectations, or the need to perform appropriate royal behavior. He could think, feel, and react authentically without concern about how his responses would be interpreted or used by others. Frederick described Wilhelm's evening routines with particular fondness. After a day of physical work in the forest, Wilhelm would return to his cabin tired, but satisfied with his accomplishments. He would prepare a simple meal, tend to his tools and equipment, and spend quiet hours reading by firelight or writing in journals where he recorded observations about forest life and philosophical reflections inspired by his solitary experiences. These peaceful evenings represented everything that Frederick's royal life lacked: genuine privacy, authentic relaxation, and time for personal reflection without external demands or political considerations. Wilhelm could go to sleep confident that his day's work had been meaningful and that tomorrow would bring similar opportunities for useful, satisfying labor. The philosophical problem that Frederick faced was determining which life was more real. His days as king were filled with ceremonies, meetings, decisions that affected thousands of people, interactions with other monarchs and diplomats. But much of royal life felt performative, artificial, removed from direct engagement with physical reality. Dream Wilhelm's life, while simpler, felt more authentic because every action had immediate, tangible consequences. The woodsman's work was honest. Trees were cut or they weren't. Paths were clear or they weren't. The cabin was warm and dry or it wasn't. There was no ambiguity, no spin, no political interpretation required. Frederick began having what he described in his journals as reality attacks moments, when he would be in the middle of royal duties and suddenly question whether the elaborate court ceremony he was participating in was actually happening, or whether he was really Wilhelm the woodsman, temporarily lost in a fantasy about being a king. These philosophical doubts began affecting Frederick's ability to function as a monarch. During diplomatic meetings, he would find himself studying the wood grain in conference tables, wondering about the trees from which the lumber had been cut. While reviewing military reports, he would get distracted by thoughts about the forests where battles were supposed to take place, considering how the terrain and vegetation would actually affect troop movements. Frederick started making unusual requests that concerned his advisors. He wanted detailed reports about the actual landscape conditions in his territories, not strategic assessments, but information about forest health, timber resources, and seasonal changes. He began taking long walks in wooded areas near his palaces, often alone, studying trees and forest ecology with intensity that seemed inappropriate for a king. The most dramatic expression of Frederick's woodsman dream obsession was his decision to build what he called forest councils meetings, where he would consult with actual foresters, hunters, and woodsmen about land management policies. These weren't ceremonial consultations with carefully selected representatives. Frederick insisted on talking with working men who spent their days in forests, asking them practical questions about sustainable timber harvesting, wildlife management, and ecological balance. The Prussian court was bewildered. Why would their highly educated, sophisticated king need to consult with peasant woodsmen about matters of state? But Frederick's journals reveal that these conversations were the only times he felt completely confident that he was dealing with reliable information rather than political opinions or theoretical abstractions. Frederick's woodsman dreams also influenced his approach to royal decision-making. He began insisting on personally visiting territories before making policies about them, rather than relying on reports from governors and administrators. He wanted to see and touch the actual landscapes that would be affected by royal decisions. This hands-on approach made Frederick a more effective king in some ways. His policies became more practical and better, adapted to local conditions. But it also made him psychologically uncomfortable with the abstract nature of political power. He began questioning whether ruling people from a distance through laws and bureaucracies was fundamentally less honest than Wilhelm's direct, physical work in the forest. The most poignant aspect of Frederick's story is that his woodsman dreams never resolved the philosophical questions they raised. He remained king until his death, but his private writings suggest that he never stopped wondering whether Wilhelm the woodsman might be the real person and Frederick the king might be just an elaborate dream. Frederick died in 1713, still uncertain about the relationship between his two identities. Among his personal effects, his servants found carefully detailed journals about forest management, woodcraft techniques, and ecological observations, as if he had been preparing for a life that he might or might not have been dreaming about. Makes you wonder about the nature of identity and reality, doesn't it? Frederick's dreams raised the question: if an alternative life feels as real and complete as your actual life, how do you determine which one is true? Sometimes our subconscious creates identities that feel more authentic than our conscious roles, and we're left trying to figure out who we really are underneath all the external expectations and obligations. There's this fascinating case from 16th century Spain involving Princess Isabella of Castile, who had recurring dreams about being a seamstress in a small village outside Toledo. These weren't grand visions of revolutionary social change. They were quiet, detailed dreams about the satisfying rhythm of needlework and the pride that comes from creating something beautiful and useful with your own hands. In her dreams, Isabella spent her days sitting by a window, carefully stitching intricate embroidery on clothes that would be worn by families in her village. She could feel the texture of different threads under her fingers, see the patterns emerging stitch by stitch, and experience the deep satisfaction of completing garments that would bring beauty and comfort to people's lives. What made these dreams psychologically significant for Isabella wasn't just the craft itself, but the sense of completion they provided. As a princess, her life was filled with half-finished obligations, political negotiations that dragged on for months, social ceremonies that felt meaningless, educational studies that seemed disconnected from any practical application. But Dream Isabella's needlework had clear beginnings, middles, and ends. Start a dress, work on it steadily, finish it, see someone wear it with pride. Dream Isabella lived in a small stone house with thick walls that kept the interior cool during hot Spanish summers and warm during winter months. The main room was arranged specifically for needlework, with a comfortable chair positioned by the largest window to catch the best natural light. Wooden frames of various sizes leaned against the walls, holding pieces of fabric at different stages of completion. The house was filled with the tools and materials of the seamstress trade, baskets containing threads in dozens of colors, needles of different sizes for different types of work, small scissors with sharp points for detailed cutting, thimbles worn smooth from years of use. Every item had its specific purpose and place, creating an environment organized around productive work rather than ceremonial display. Isabella's needlework in the dreams wasn't the decorative embroidery that royal women were expected to practice as accomplishments. Dream Isabella created functional clothing, work shirts for farmers, dresses for village women, children's garments that would withstand active play, ceremonial clothing for weddings and religious festivals. Each piece was designed to serve specific needs while incorporating beautiful, decorative elements that brought joy to the wearer. The process of creating these garments required skills that Isabella found deeply satisfying. She would begin by meeting with customers to understand their needs, what type of work they did, what occasions they needed clothing for, what colors and styles they preferred. These conversations were collaborative and practical, focused on creating clothing that would serve real purposes in people's lives. Dream Isabella would then design patterns, select appropriate fabrics and threads, and begin the careful process of cutting and stitching. Each step required attention to detail and technical skill, making sure seams were straight and strong, ensuring that decorative elements enhanced rather than interfered with the garment's function, creating clothing that would look beautiful and last for years of regular wear. The princess began spending more time on her own embroidery, which was considered appropriate for a royal woman but had previously been just one of many required accomplishments. After her seamstress dreams began, Isabella's needlework became obsessively detailed and beautiful. She would spend hours creating intricate patterns that were far beyond what was expected for decorative royal handwork. Isabella also started paying attention to the clothes worn by servants and commoners, noticing details about fabric quality, stitching techniques, and design functionality that she had never observed before. She began commissioning simpler, more practical clothing for herself, focusing on craftsmanship and comfort rather than the elaborate, uncomfortable court fashions that emphasize status over wearability. The really touching aspect of Isabella's story is that she eventually established workshops where royal seamstresses could teach needlework skills to women from poorer families. She justified this as charity work, but her private journals reveal that she was actually trying to create the kind of meaningful crafting community that she experienced in her dreams. Isabella never became an actual seamstress, but her dreams taught her to find genuine satisfaction in the process of creating beautiful, functional things rather than just owning beautiful, expensive things. Sometimes the most profound changes happen not through dramatic life overhauls, but through discovering deeper meaning in activities that were already part of your life. Prince Edward of England, who would eventually become Edward III, had a series of dreams as a teenager in the early 1300s about working as a blacksmith's apprentice in a village forge. These dreams came during a particularly difficult period of his royal education, when he was struggling with the abstract political theories and diplomatic protocols that were supposed to prepare him for kingship. In his dreams, Edward worked alongside Master Thomas, a patient blacksmith who taught him to shape metal through heat, hammer work, and careful timing. Dream Edward learned to judge temperature by the color of glowing iron, to control the force and angle of hammer strikes, to create tools and horseshoes that would serve specific practical functions in village life. What appealed to teenage Edward about these blacksmith dreams was the immediate feedback they provided. If you heated the metal incorrectly, it would become brittle or stay too soft. If your hammer technique was wrong, the shape would be uneven or weak. If you misjudged the timing, you would have to start over. The work was demanding, but the standards were clear and the results were obvious. This was completely different from Edward's royal education, where he was constantly evaluated on abstract principles and theoretical understanding. His tutors would tell him that his diplomatic analysis was adequate or his military strategy showed promise, but he never knew whether his ideas would actually work in real situations. Dream Edward's blacksmith work, by contrast, was immediately testable. The horseshoes he made either fit horses properly or they didn't. The tools he created either functioned effectively or they needed to be remade. There was no ambiguity, no political interpretation, no need to wonder whether his work was actually good or just diplomatically acceptable. Edward's fascination with his blacksmith dreams led him to spend time observing actual metalworkers and learning basic techniques. This hands-on interest in practical skills made him a more effective king later because he understood the technical challenges involved in military equipment production, castle construction, and the various crafts that supported medieval society. But the deeper impact of Edward's blacksmith dreams was psychological. They showed him that real confidence comes from developing genuine competence in difficult skills, rather than from inheriting titles and expecting others to defer to your authority. Dream Edward had to earn respect through the quality of his work, and that felt more satisfying than receiving respect based on his royal bloodline. Maria Theresa of Austria, one of the most successful female rulers in European history, had recurring dreams throughout the 1750s about being the wife of a village baker, managing the daily operations of a small bakery while raising children and serving customers who knew her as Anna rather than as Your Imperial Majesty. In these dreams, Maria Theresa's day began before dawn, kneading dough and stoking ovens, while her baker husband prepared for the day's baking. Dream Anna knew every regular customer personally, which families preferred which types of bread, who was struggling financially and might need smaller loaves at reduced prices, whose children had favorite pastries that always made them smile. What made these dreams psychologically compelling for Maria? Teresa was the direct connection between her work and people's daily happiness. When Dreamana sold a loaf of fresh bread to a young mother, she could see immediate satisfaction on the woman's face. When children came to buy sweet rolls with coins they had saved, their joy was genuine and personal. This was different from Maria Theresa's experience as empress, where her policies affected millions of people, but she rarely saw the direct human consequences of her decisions. Imperial reforms were implemented through layers of bureaucracy, and their effects on individual families were filtered through administrative reports rather than experienced personally. Dreamana's bakery represented a world where service was immediate, personal, and emotionally rewarding. Every transaction was also a human interaction. Every product that left the shop would contribute directly to someone's nourishment and happiness. The success of the business was measured not just in profits, but in community satisfaction and family loyalty that developed over years of consistent service. Maria Theresa's baker wife dreams influenced her later policies in interesting ways. She became more focused on what she called daily bread issues, ensuring adequate food supply, supporting local merchants and craftspeople, and creating policies that affected the texture of ordinary life rather than just grand political strategies. The Empress also began making unannounced visits to markets and shops in Vienna, talking directly with merchants and customers to understand how imperial policies actually affected people's daily experiences. This direct feedback approach made her policies more practical and effective because she learned to evaluate them based on their impact on real families rather than just their theoretical soundness. King Gustav III of Sweden had a series of dreams in the 1780s about living as a fisherman on one of the remote islands in the Stockholm archipelago. In these dreams, Gustav spent his days alone on the water, reading weather patterns, understanding fish behavior, and living in complete harmony with the natural rhythms of sea and sky. Dream Gustav's life as a fisherman was solitary but not lonely. He felt connected to the natural world in ways that his royal life, despite all its human interaction, never provided. He understood tides, wind patterns, seasonal fish migrations, and weather changes with an intimacy that made him feel like part of the maritime ecosystem rather than separate from it. What appealed to Gustav about the fisherman dreams was the self-sufficiency they represented. Dream Gustav caught fish for his own meals, repaired his own nets and boat, navigated by stars and natural landmarks, and survived through skills that depended on no one else's authority or approval. This contrasted sharply with Gustav's royal existence, where even his most basic needs were met by elaborate networks of servants, advisors, and administrators. As king, Gustav was simultaneously the most powerful person in Sweden and completely dependent on others for everything from meals to transportation to information about his own kingdom. You know, after hearing all these stories about royals dreaming of peasant life, you might be wondering, what did people throughout history actually think dreams meant? And more importantly, what does modern science say about this whole phenomenon? Because let me tell you, humans have been trying to figure out dreams for literally thousands of years. And some of their theories were, well, let's just say they were creative. Let's start with the ancient world, where dreams weren't just random brain activity during sleep. They were basically cosmic text messages from the gods. And I'm not exaggerating here. The Babylonians and Egyptians took dreams so seriously that they created entire bureaucracies around dream interpretation. Imagine having a job title like Chief Royal Dream Analyst. That was actually a thing. The Babylonians, those overachievers of the ancient world, compiled what was essentially the first dream encyclopedia. They called it the Ikerzak, which sounds like something you'd sneeze, but it was actually a comprehensive guide to dream meanings. They cataloged hundreds of different dream scenarios and their supposed meanings, kind of like an ancient version of those dream dictionaries you see in bookstores today. But here's what's fascinating. They didn't just make up random interpretations. They based their dream book on actual case studies. They would record someone's dream, wait to see what happened to them, and then add that to their database. So if 10 people dreamed about flying fish and 7 of them got promoted at work, flying fish dreams got classified as career advancement indicators. It was actually pretty scientific for 3000 BCE. The Babylonians also divided dreams into 2 categories: Good dreams sent by the gods and bad dreams sent by demons, which, when you think about it, is not that different from how we still talk about dreams today. We have good dreams and nightmares. Some things never change, apparently. Meanwhile, over in ancient Egypt, they were taking this whole dream thing to the next level. Egyptian priests developed elaborate ritual processes for inducing prophetic dreams. They would have people sleep in temples dedicated to specific gods, hoping to receive divine guidance through their dreams. This practice was called dream incubation, and it was like an ancient version of going to therapy, except your therapist was a deity and the session happened while you were unconscious. The Greeks, never once to be outdone in the intellectual department, created their own god specifically for dreams, Morpheus. And unlike a lot of other gods who had multiple responsibilities, Morpheus had one job, managing human dreams. He was basically the world's first sleep specialist, except he was immortal and could shapeshift. Greek philosophers had some interesting theories about dreams too. Plato, that guy who gave us the cave allegory, believed that dreams revealed our secret, repressed desires. Sound familiar? Yeah, Freud basically borrowed that idea 2,000 years later and claimed he invented it. Plato thought that during the day, our rational minds kept our darker impulses in check. But at night, when logic went to sleep, all those suppressed urges came out to play in our dreams. His student Aristotle, who disagreed with Plato about pretty much everything, had a more practical theory. He thought dreams were just the brain trying to process incomplete sensory information from the day. Like, if you saw something out of the corner of your eye but didn't pay attention to it, your brain might try to fill in the details while you slept, which is actually not that far off from some modern theories about dream function. The Romans, being Romans, turned dream interpretation into a business. They had professional dream interpreters who would set up shops in marketplaces, kind of like ancient fortune tellers. People would come to them with their dreams, pay a fee, and get an interpretation. It was like ancient Yelp reviews. 5 stars, Quintus correctly predicted my promotion based on my dream about purple elephants. Now, let's fast forward to medieval Europe, where things got interesting. Medieval Christians had a complicated relationship with dreams. On one hand, the Bible was full of prophetic dreams, Joseph interpreting Pharaoh's dreams about 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows, Jacob dreaming about a ladder to heaven, the wise men being warned in dreams not to return to Herod. So clearly, God could communicate through dreams. But medieval theologians were also worried about the devil using dreams to tempt people or lead them astray. So they developed elaborate systems for determining whether a dream was divine, demonic, or just the result of eating too much cheese before bed. Yes, they actually believed that certain foods could cause prophetic dreams. Medieval dream theory was basically part theology, part early nutrition science. Islamic scholars during the medieval period developed their own sophisticated approach to dream interpretation. They distinguished between 3 types of dreams: ruya, true dreams from Allah; halm, dreams from Satan; and ajath alam, confused dreams caused by daily thoughts and experiences. Islamic dream interpretation became so refined that it influenced European dream theory for centuries. Moving over to Asia, Chinese philosophy had its own take on dreams. Traditional Chinese medicine believed that the soul had 2 parts, the hun and the po. During sleep, the hun would leave the body and travel through the dream realm, while the po stayed behind to keep the body functioning. This concept of dream travel is remarkably similar to what many indigenous cultures around the world believed independently. Ancient Chinese texts describe dreams as journeys to other dimensions where the dreaming soul could encounter spirits, visit distant places, and even glimpse the future. The philosopher Zhuangzi famously wrote about dreaming he was a butterfly, then waking up and wondering if he was actually a butterfly dreaming he was a human. Talk about an identity crisis. But perhaps the most sophisticated ancient approach to dreams came from India, where Hindu and Buddhist traditions developed detailed theories about consciousness and dreaming. Hindu texts describe 4 states of consciousness: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and a transcendent state called Turiya. Dreams were seen as a bridge between ordinary consciousness and higher spiritual awareness. Buddhist philosophy taught that dreams could provide insights into the nature of reality itself. If dream experiences could feel completely real while we were having them, what did that say about the nature of our waking reality? This question still puzzles philosophers and neuroscientists today. Native American cultures developed their own rich traditions around dreams, often viewing them as spiritual journeys or communications with ancestors. Many tribes had specific rituals for inducing prophetic dreams, and dream interpretation was considered a sacred skill passed down through generations of spiritual leaders. The Senoi people of Malaysia created an entire culture around dream sharing and interpretation. Children were taught from an early age to remember, discuss, and learn from their dreams. They believed that by actively engaging with dream content, people could solve problems, develop creativity, and maintain psychological health. Now, let's jump forward to the modern era, where science started trying to figure out what the heck was actually going on in our brains while we dreamed. The discovery of REM sleep in the 1950s was a game changer. Suddenly, researchers could actually observe when people were dreaming and study what was happening in their brains during dreams. Modern neuroscience has given us some fascinating insights into the dreaming process. During REM sleep, our brains are incredibly active, almost as active as when we're awake. But the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for logic and critical thinking, basically goes offline. Meanwhile, the emotional centers of the brain and the areas responsible for memory and pattern recognition are working overtime. This creates the perfect conditions for the weird, illogical, but emotionally intense experiences we call dreams. Our brains are essentially making up stories using fragments of memories, emotions, and sensory information, but without our usual logical filters to keep things coherent. So what about prophetic dreams? How does science explain cases where people seem to dream about future events with remarkable accuracy? Well, there are several theories, and they're all pretty fascinating. First, there's the pattern recognition theory. Our brains are incredibly sophisticated pattern detection machines. We're constantly processing enormous amounts of information about our environment, social relationships, and various trends and changes happening around us. Most of this processing happens below the level of conscious awareness. It's possible that sometimes our unconscious minds detect patterns and make predictions about likely future events, and these predictions surface in our dreams. So a prophetic dream about someone getting sick might actually be our brain's way of processing subtle signs of illness that we noticed but didn't consciously register. Then there's the probability theory. Think about how many dreams you have over the course of your lifetime, thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Even if dreams were completely random, you'd expect some of them to accidentally match future events just by chance. We tend to remember the hits and forget the misses, which makes prophetic dreams seem more common than they actually are. There's also the self-fulfilling prophecy effect. If you have a vivid dream about something happening, and you believe the dream might be prophetic, you might unconsciously change your behavior in ways that make the dream more likely to come true. It's like your dream becomes a prediction that influences its own fulfillment. Selective memory is another factor. Often, when something significant happens in our lives, we search our memories for any prior dreams or intuitions that might have predicted it. Sometimes we find connections that weren't actually as clear or specific as we remember them being. Our brains are remarkably good at finding patterns and connections, even when they're not really there. Modern research has also discovered that dreams vary significantly across different cultures and environments. Studies comparing dreams from forager communities in Africa with dreams from Western societies found fascinating differences. People from traditional communities were more likely to have dreams that started with threats but ended with social support and community solutions. Western dreamers, on the other hand, were more likely to have dreams focused on individual stress and anxiety, often without clear resolutions. This suggests that our cultural environment and social structures significantly influence not just how we interpret dreams, but what we actually dream about. Recent neuroscience research has also identified some interesting patterns in the brains of people who report frequent prophetic dreams. Some studies suggest that certain individuals might have unusual connectivity between different brain regions, particularly areas involved in memory, pattern recognition, and temporal processing. But here's the thing that makes this whole topic so endlessly fascinating. Science still hasn't completely solved the mystery of why we dream at all. We know a lot about how dreams work, but the ultimate purpose of dreaming remains one of the biggest unsolved puzzles in neuroscience and psychology. Some theories suggest that dreams help us process emotions and consolidate memories. Others propose that dreams serve as a kind of virtual reality system where our brains can simulate different scenarios and practice responses to potential challenges. Still, others think dreams might be just a byproduct of brain maintenance processes that happen during sleep. What's clear is that throughout human history, across all cultures and time periods, people have found dreams meaningful and significant. Whether they're messages from gods, glimpses of the future, or just the brain's way of filing away the day's experiences, dreams continue to fascinate us and influence our understanding of consciousness, reality, and human nature. And maybe that's the real point. Whether or not dreams can actually predict the future might be less important than the fact that they connect us to something larger than our everyday waking experience. They remind us that consciousness is mysterious, that reality might be more complex than it appears, and that there's still so much about the human mind that we don't understand. Sometimes the most profound truths aren't the ones we can prove in laboratories, but the ones we experience in the quiet moments when logic goes to sleep and our minds wander into realms where kings can be bakers and emperors can find peace in growing rice. Now, before we let you drift fully into sleep, let me share with you some of the most fascinating, obscure, and downright bizarre facts about dreams that even the history books barely mention. Did you know that some of the oldest recorded dreams come from ancient Egypt? They took dreams so seriously that they carved royal dream inscriptions on stone. For example, there's the story of Prince Thutmose, who dreamt that the god Re appeared to tell him to clear the sand from the Great Sphinx. When he did, he became pharaoh. Talk about a divine dream commission. The dream wasn't just a private moment. It was publicly immortalized and used to legitimize his rule. Throughout history, people have reported prophetic dreams, but some of them were downright stunning in their detail. For instance, in medieval Europe, reports exist of nobles who had intimate, highly accurate dreams about their own deaths. One such dream involved a noblewoman who dreamt vividly of her funeral procession days before she passed. Not all dreams revolve around death or destiny. Some dreams have inspired art and science. A famous example is the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who dreamt of an exotic palace, inspiring his famous poem Kubla Khan. The dream was so vivid he tried to capture it immediately upon waking, though famously interrupted, leaving the poem incomplete but still mesmerizing. And here's a gem. Louis XVI, yes, that same king we talked about, reportedly had a dream about himself as a baker, an experience so powerful that it influenced his mindset during the tumultuous times leading to the French Revolution. We covered that, but this kind of dream, where royals dream of normal life, might be more common than we think. Another jaw-dropper, some dreams about disasters weren't just coincidences. Multiple passengers of the Titanic had recurring nightmares of the ship's doomed days before the tragedy. Some chose not to board after these dreams. So many shared similar visions, it was almost like the future was sending a broadcast. Further into the strange, did you know some people dream exclusively in black and white? It turns out roughly 12% of people never see color in their dreams. Imagine the rest of us bathing in vibrant, surreal colors while they wander a monochrome dream world. Speaking of bizarre, don't fall for the myth that we swallow spiders in our sleep, unless you have some very adventurous arachnids in your room. It's a myth that lingers, but thankfully untrue. How about this? During REM sleep, the stage where the wildest dreams happen, our muscles are paralyzed. It's the body's way of keeping us from physically acting out whatever chaos our brain concocts. So when you dream you're running from a monster, your legs aren't actually moving, which is good because otherwise bedrooms everywhere would be an obstacle course. Have you ever had a recurring dream? Turns out that common recurring themes include being chased, falling, or showing up unprepared for an important event. These repeats might be your brain's way of nudging you to confront some unresolved stress. Here's a stunning fact. Despite all our advances in technology, scientists still debate why we dream. Some think dreams help process emotions, others say they simulate threats so our brains can practice responses, and some even suggest they function as a kind of overnight creativity lab. Different cultures dream differently. Anthropological studies reveal that people living in hunter-gatherer societies often report dreams involving community and animals, while urban dwellers' dreams focus more on personal drama and everyday objects. Dreams truly mirror our waking lives in fascinating ways. Here's a fun one. People tend to remember dreams best when waking during or just after REM sleep, which tends to happen more frequently in the early morning hours or when sleeping longer on weekends. That's why your dreams might feel extra intense if you're sleeping in. And next time you feel bad about a nightmare, remember, they're often your brain's way of working through fear and anxiety so you can better face challenges during waking hours. Some cultures believe dreams cause physical effects. Ever heard of a dream so powerful it gave someone a rash or a headache? Across the world, people have reported such phenomena, blurring lines between mind, body, and spirit. In some ancient cultures, elaborate rituals existed for dream sharing. Among the Senoi people in Malaysia, for example, children were taught from a young age to remember and discuss their dreams openly, using them as tools for conflict resolution and creativity. One of the quirkiest dream facts: your brain's visual cortex is highly active during dreams, which is why dreams often teem with unpredictable, surreal imagery. Yet the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for logic, is quiet, explaining why dreams can be wonderfully bizarre and yet narratively nonsensical. Here's something that will blow your mind. Some people have what's called mutual dreaming, where two people report having shared the same dream experience. While science hasn't been able to explain this phenomenon, documented cases exist throughout history of spouses, twins, or close friends describing identical dream scenarios that they experienced on the same night. And speaking of unexplained phenomena, there are documented cases of people who've never been to certain places having incredibly detailed dreams about specific locations, only to later visit those places and find them exactly as they dreamed. Makes you wonder about the nature of memory, imagination, and reality itself. Here's a historical curiosity. During the Black Death in medieval Europe, entire villages would sometimes report shared nightmares about death and disease. Some historians suggest these collective dreams might have helped communities prepare psychologically for tragedy, or they might have been early warning systems based on unconscious observations about public health. One more strange fact: blind people who were born without sight still dream, but their dreams are primarily composed of sounds, textures, smells, and emotions rather than visual imagery. However, people who lost their sight after birth continue to have visual dreams, sometimes for decades after losing their vision. And finally, here's something that connects us all. Despite all our cultural differences, geographical distances, and historical periods, humans across time and space have consistently reported similar dream themes. Being chased, falling, flying, being naked in public, losing teeth. These universal dream experiences suggest that, at some deep level, our sleeping minds share common fears, desires, and experiences that transcend individual circumstances. So, as you drift from listening to these stories into the world of dreams, remember that you are joining a lineage of dreamers who, across centuries and continents, have explored this mysterious realm, finding profound meaning, guidance, and sometimes a little spooky truth. Sweet dreams, or should I say prophetic journeys? If you're somehow still awake, which honestly amazes me at this point, you've just journeyed through some of the most fascinating stories about royals who discovered that sometimes the grass really is greener on the other side, especially when that grass is growing in a peasant's vegetable garden. Tonight, we've explored how kings dreamed of baking bread, empresses longed to tend sheep, emperors found peace in pottery, and queens discovered freedom in simplicity. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're reminders that happiness doesn't always come from having more, but sometimes from wanting less, from doing work that matters, from connecting authentically with other people and the natural world. Maybe these royal dreamers were onto something. Maybe our subconscious minds sometimes know truths that our waking selves are too busy, too distracted, or too trapped by circumstances to recognize. Maybe the lives we think we want and the lives that would actually fulfill us are completely different things. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your corner of the world? And if you've ever had dreams about living a completely different life, drop them in the comments. Do you dream about being a farmer when you're stuck in an office? A teacher when you're in corporate? A baker when you're a lawyer? Sometimes our dreams reveal truths about ourselves that we're not ready to face while we're awake. If you enjoyed tonight's journey through the strange intersection of power and simplicity, make sure to subscribe for more weird historical stories that'll help you drift off to sleep. We'll be back next week with another exploration of the bizarre, wonderful, and sometimes profound ways that history surprises us. And remember, sometimes the most powerful people in history found their greatest satisfaction in the simplest dreams. Maybe there's a lesson there for all of us about what really matters in life. Sweet dreams, and may your subconscious show you exactly what you need to see, even if it's not what you expect. See you in your dreams.